Hello again, students. We're going to continue our discussion of Topic 6 on the Great Depression and the New Deal by looking today at the effects of the Great Depression on Americans. The images and the ideas most associated with the effects of the Great Depression are oftentimes those of the large cities, where many people were employed as factory workers. Once factories became subjected to underconsumption and started to close down in order to compensate for that, many Americans found themselves unemployed. The national unemployment rate reached an all-time high in 1933 of about 25%. So 1 in 4 Americans overall were out of work and looking for work. Those who managed to keep their jobs still faced wage and hour cuts, some as high as 10, 20, 30% or more, which severely cut back on their income and ability to support their families. Many unemployed men would stand in line at bread lines, as you see in this photograph here, waiting for handouts from private charities or from government agencies. When people couldn't pay their rents, they would oftentimes be evicted and find themselves homeless. Homeless men and women were seen throughout the cities sleeping on park benches, in cardboard boxes, and in alleyways, and in many places, shanty towns sprang up on public land or vacant lots where people, some of them who had been carpenters and were now unemployed, would cobble together shacks, and little small towns would appear in places like Central Park in New York City had the largest of these shanty towns, and they were referred to as Hoovervilles because the president at the time, Herbert Hoover, was given a lot of the blame for the Great Depression. Some people tried to stay in their homes by selling all of their possessions or as much of what they could in order to make rent, or moving into smaller apartments with lower rents. And in some areas like Reading, Pennsylvania, there were nonviolent protests staged to prevent landlords from evicting people from their homes. But by and large, many Americans found themselves homeless, without an income, and without employment. In the countryside, things were not much better, and in many ways were worse. As we know, farmers had been facing hard times since the early 20th century, and the Great Depression is just going to make this even worse. Crop prices dropped from 1919 at the end of World War I to about 1/5 of what they had been. And this, of course, means farmers are unable to pay their debts. They're also unable to maintain their farms and their farming equipment, and to pay their mortgages. Many farmers found themselves in a situation that crop prices had dropped so low that it actually cost them more money to get their crops to market than they would actually make off of the crops. So while we've got people in the cities starving and standing in bread lines, there's crops rotting in the field and the farms because the cost for the farmers was prohibitive to actually get the food to the cities because of the drop in the prices. This is going to result in a lot of farm families being unable to pay their mortgages, and many of family farms in America will disappear. They will get bought up by larger landowners, usually at an auction. We see here this is what's oftentimes referred to as a penny auction, because the farmer's equipment and land and other possessions would be sold for pennies on the dollar at these farming auctions. And the banks would repossess their farms and attempt to sell them in this fashion. Large landowners sometimes snatch these up, and the farmers would remain on the land but no longer own it, and would become tenant farmers for these larger landowners. In some instances, farmers would get together and agree to help each other out. And so they would all show up at the auction and agree not to bid very high, make very, very low bids, and forcing the bank to sell to them at a very low price. And then they would turn around and give the equipment or whatever back to the farmers whose stuff was being put on auction and basically tell them, well, you'll just have to owe me for later on. A lot of other farmers, though, ended up moving away from the rural communities. We'll see them shrink during the 1930s, moving to the cities, looking for work there, which, as we had seen, was not really available. It should come as no surprise that the Great Depression hit the most vulnerable Americans the hardest, the poorest of the poor, who were oftentimes people of color. Wealthy people oftentimes weathered the Great Depression just fine. They had savings from which they could draw and credit that they could get loans to keep themselves going during this time period. And in fact, some wealthy people actually got wealthier off of the Great Depression because when stock prices dropped so dramatically, they bought up all the stock when it was cheap. And then when the market bounced back in the 1940s, they were able to make a fortune off of this. African Americans were particularly hard hit, but fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, because they had faced poverty for pretty much their entire lives, they were much better equipped to handle this with the support of family and church, as always. But African American workers, as one economist said, were usually first fired and last hired, meaning the Depression is not only going to be more severe for many black factory workers, but is actually going to be longer, because when factories start to close down, the first people they're going to lay off are oftentimes African American workers, and when they start hiring, they usually hire whites first and then African Americans last. Sharecroppers in the South, both white and black, were kicked off of their land as landowners could no longer afford or could no longer collect rents from them, which sent a lot of them moving to the cities looking for work, which, there really wasn't much there for them either. African American unemployment overall will be almost double the national average. 1932, their all-time low was at 50%. Half of all African American workers were out of work. Mexican and Asian American farm workers also struggled to find work, particularly as they were now starting to compete with white farm workers. Many white farmers escaping the drought on the Great Plains, called the Dust Bowl, which we'll get to in the next lesson, migrated to places where a lot of Mexican American and Asian Americans worked as farm laborers. California and other parts of the Southwest. And they were now competing with these white farm workers, who then pushed for these people to be repatriated, to be sent back or deported to their home countries. And hundreds of thousands of particularly Mexican farm workers were repatriated in the 1930s, many of them forcibly, others just through pressure, and many of them were actually American citizens, not citizens of Mexico. The Great Depression is also important not just for its economic downturn, but for the emotional toll that it took on Americans. It will profoundly change American society to face such hardships. Birth rates plummeted to their lowest in U.S. history, as many people put off having families until such a time as they could afford them. Men who were traditionally seen as the breadwinners of their family are going to be particularly hard hit and feel like they have let down their wives and children because they are unable to provide for them, which was seen as their role in American society. Some men rode the rails, going from town to town, hopping on trains, looking for work in one place or another, oftentimes finding signs saying, "Keep moving, no work here." Some just sank into despair, and the suicide rates during the 1930s, particularly among men, went up significantly. Those who kept their jobs remained in constant fear that they might lose that job at any moment. Wives and other women tried to stretch the family budgets as best they could. Many of them started looking for odd jobs and other work that they could do, doing sewing for other families and washing for them, or as household servants, although these jobs were going to be difficult to find as well. Not too many people are going to be looking to hire a servant during an economic downturn. And also, sewing the family's clothes and stretching out the food to make it last as long as possible. In the end, many families pulled together for the Great Depression and sort of held out more strongly through the hardship, but many of them also were broken apart by the Depression. Some fathers just outright abandoned their wives and children, feeling that they could not support them anymore. Many children quit school. Discipline kind of broke down, but also the necessity of trying to find work for as many people in the family as possible. Some even ran away, or others were sent to live with family members who remained employed and were still able to support them. As I mentioned before, Herbert Hoover takes a lot of the blame for this, not rightly so. He really didn't cause the Great Depression, but where he can be blamed, and is by some, is his response or failure to respond to the hard times. Hoover's response is oftentimes seen as being too little and too late to do much help. Now, originally, Hoover just saw this as part of the normal ups and downs of the capitalist business cycle, and he was a firm believer in the United States government not getting involved in the economy and wanted them to stay out. But as it continued to go on, he started to see that this was coming to be a larger problem, not a normal part of the business cycle. He encouraged volunteerism and localism rather than having the government get involved. He encouraged charities to handle a lot of the relief. He encouraged the wealthy to donate more to charities, and he encouraged businesses to keep their employment and wages and prices at the same level until this had passed. Well, many business owners were afraid of losing their businesses, so they started laying off workers. They ignored this voluntary call to action. Charities, rich people were either unwilling or unable to donate enough to keep up with the crisis of the Great Depression. And local governments, which Hoover saw as being the first line of defense for relief, just didn't have enough resources to keep up with the situation. Finally, Hoover will take action after a lot of criticism at the federal level, and he urged Congress to create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And this will give out over $1 billion in loans to banks, railroads, and big businesses based on the idea of what's called trickle-down economics. The hope would be that the businesses would, with that extra money, hire more workers and put more people to work who would then be able to buy things and have the economy recover. If you notice, compared to John Maynard Keynes's idea, trickle down is a top down. Put more money at the top of the economic pyramid and it will eventually make its way down, whereas Keynes thought that more money at the bottom would encourage those people to do more of the buying, and that would recover the economy. Well, in the case of Hoover's attempts, it was not very successful. Most of the loans that the businesses and banks got, they used to keep themselves safe and to weather the Depression, giving them a little bit of savings to build upon and ignoring any sort of calls to hire more people. Taking a look at the graphic organizer for this one, we have 8 different things that were affected, groups or people that were affected by the Great Depression. And I want you to tell me how each one was affected and why the Great Depression is what led to that. So zeroing in here, let's take the homeless people as an example. How were they affected by the Great Depression? We saw people sleeping on park benches, building Hoovervilles, and some protests to stop evictions. And why? Well, because once people lost their jobs, they couldn't pay their rents, and the landlords evicted them. All right, te amo, ciao.